I'm not cold. I'm not even cold-natured. In fact, I'm actually hot-natured. But I feel awkward being up here without a jacket on. But my suit jacket is hanging on the back of one of the chairs right beside my door because I set it down to pick up a couple other things and then walked off and left it. I'm hoping my wife brings it. So I'm keeping this on just because it makes me comfortable. We're going to go ahead and get started. I've got a lesson that in some ways won't be new to you, but I hope in some ways it helps broaden the scope of what I think that God is trying to tell us with the book of Job. It's actually one of my favorite books, and I'm sure that if you've listened to my son, which some of you have, you've listened to me on some of our apologetics, we refer back to Job because you were given some insights to how God structured the world, how he built it, and some of the things that he himself describes about this world. But that's not what this lesson is. I just want you to understand, I spent a lot of time in Job. But the reason why the book, maybe I shouldn't say the reason, one of the main reasons it seems to me the book is written might get lost on us today. And that's because we might not really understand the scope of Job himself. So what I want you to do is I want you to grab your Bible. I hold my phone up because that's where I access my Bible from. And I want you to go to Job. I want you to go right to the beginning of the book because it's from that point that we're going to get started. Just go to Job chapter 1, verse 1. There was a man in the land of, I'm going to pronounce it Uz. You might pronounce it Uz, but I think it's Uz, whose name was Job. And that man was blameless and upright and one who feared God and turned away from evil. Now, my guess is you know that about Job. You've seen that, okay? Now, before I go any further, the book of Job, to take in full appreciation, let me pitch an idea to you that maybe you haven't recognized before about this particular book. More than likely, this is the oldest book in the Bible. Now, Moses, of course, wrote, and through utilizing Joshua later, wrote the first 5 books, the Pentateuch, the first 5, we call them the books of the law. And then you got 12 books of history. If you've got a quick and easy way inside of your head to keep up with, how to organize the Bible, great and fine. I do it like this. I say, hey, the Old Testament is 5, 12, 5, 5, 12. So there's the 5 books of the law, then there's 12 books of history, then there are 5 books of poetry, also called 5 books of wisdom. I sort of prefer that. And then there's the 5 major prophets, and then there's 12 minor prophets. And that gets you all of those books. So it gets you all of those 39 books. So this is the first one of those books of wisdom. And when you read it, you may not think of it as poetry, and that's the reason why I kind of prefer the whole wisdom thing. But it's probably the actually oldest dated book. We know when Moses lived, right? We pretty much have a pretty good understanding of how far back he was when he wrote, and he did write about the beginning of the world. So his subject matter goes all the way back to creation. But as far as the book itself being written, it was written way past when Job was written. Job was actually written, and we don't know by who, but it was written quite a long time ago. We feel like it's the oldest book of the Bible. And what's really interesting is when you look at it with this perspective, you see that the scope of what that book really does for a lot of people, pre-Hebrew, pre-Israelite instruction, it's actually a remarkable story. It's a remarkable recording. But that being said, there's a lot about Job we might not understand. So what I want to do is I want to talk about the fact that, yes, he's blameless. In God's eyes, he's upright. And part of that was that he shunned evil. But let's get to here. I'm gonna skip ahead. Let's talk about where he's at. Land of Uz. And like I said, that's how I pronounce it. If you can't see, we've got Egypt sitting over here. You had the northern part of the African continent, and then you've got that part where Saudi Arabia is, and then you've got what we call or refer to as the Middle East, kind of wrapped around the Mediterranean, all the way up to Turkey, and even going over toward what we would then get into Europe. You can't quite see the Europe part. I'll actually blow it up just a little bit. I know that looked like that got smaller, but I blew the picture up inside the smaller square or rectangle. And so now you can see the Nile, and you can see Egypt, and you can see where the land of Uz was. I'm not meaning to make that rhyme. Now, that's going to become important because in order for us to come back and get, actually I need to go backwards, there we go. In order to get the scope of what we're talking about, now let's go back to our text. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. But just for briefness, I said 7 boys, 3 girls. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He possessed 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 female donkeys, very many servants, so that this man was the greatest of all the people in the East. But that's the part that I think a lot of times people might gloss over when they're reading this, because we're going to get to the part that, I won't say piques our interest, but it's certainly the focus of the story, which is all the hardship that Job eventually goes through and his faith as he maintains that as he's going through there. And certainly the overarching 10,000-foot view of this book is about that faith. And that is essentially what I'm eventually going to talk about. But I think it's hard for us sometimes, especially in the world we live in today that is so incredibly rich. The nation we live in today is so prosperous that we have, in my personal opinion, a false idea about what it is to be a human being. I think in some ways we kind of think we all live this way, and we do not, and have not for the history of time. So I think sometimes when you say, hey, he was the greatest man of the East, maybe it helps us to understand what we mean, first of all, about being the greatest in the East. So when we talk about this over here, remember this is a really old book. The Egyptians, quite possibly at this time, we're talking about them building pyramids and things like that. They were a great civilization at that time, not the kind of nation they are now. They were the epicenter of civilization at that time. They were huge. There were some other centers north of them and whatnot, but from the perspective of that area, they were the huge center of urban and suburban life in that area of the world. The land of Uz is to the east of that. And if you'll notice, it's on the other side of that little peninsula, right? The little Arabian Peninsula. So it's on the other side of that. And then you've got this whole area that goes over to what we might think of, if we were looking backwards in the Old Testament, we might think of that area as Babylonia. But that's always been referred to as the East. This man was said to be the greatest of those. Now, was he good? Yes. Was he righteous? Yes. Was he blameless? Yes. Was he someone who shunned evil? All of those things were yes, but there were probably a number of people who did that. So let's put into scope what's really trying to be translated to us, but I think we might lose. 7,000 sheep. 7,000 sheep. There's a few of you up here I know who happen to run cattle. Okay? Typically, you don't run cattle and sheep, in the same place, and I get that. Out west, that's almost fighting words. You have people who herded sheep, and there's people who herded cattle, and you didn't mix the two. It was very Romeo and Juliet. So ultimately, 7,000 sheep. I want you to consider this. How many thousands of acres would this person have to have in order to run those sheep? A tremendous amount. And by the way, why do you have sheep?
For meat, for wool, for their growth.
Meat and wool. And that's it, meat and wool. There you go, 7,000. Wool taken 2 or 3 or 4 times a year, depending on the climate in the area and what they're eating. It's an incredible amount of wool manufacturing. And he was apparently at the top of the heap there. Something else. We're talking about 7,000 sheep. How many people are you going to have? Servants, herdsmen, if you will, to keep up with 7,000 sheep. You're going to have a lot. I mean, one guy keeping up with 100 sheep, moving from field to field and taking care of the wool, maybe he does that. Maybe 100, right? Luke 15, we get the parable where Jesus actually talks about how there's a shepherd that has 100 sheep and he loses the one and he leaves the 99 to go find the one. I don't think that's hard to understand that one person over 100 sheep is doable, but boy, when you start getting much further than that, then it starts becoming undoable. How many people are we talking about? We're talking about having a huge number of servants just to deal with the sheep. And then, what are you going to do with all that wool? Got to store it, got to pack it. You might process some of it, but you're going to sell it. It's not like you're going to pile it up in your barn. It's not going to do you any good. There's a reason why you're producing all that 7,000 sheep and wool. He had 3,000 camels. Can you imagine how bad that smelled? Yes. I don't know if you ever smelled a camel. I got to see one once when I was a kid at the circus. And you knew they were coming before you saw them. It was like that. To me, maybe there it's not that far of a smell. But 3,000 camels. Anybody got an idea what you do with a camel? What are they for?
In that, they rode.
They were ultimately transportation. They're the semi-trucks of the old ancient world. They are for transporting that 7,000's worth of sheep's wool up and down those caravan corridors. The King's Highway that rode all over the Middle East down into Egypt was completely full of just caravan after caravan after caravan of camels carrying goods to the place where they're going to sell those markets.
Camels more than they milk cows.
We're going to talk about milk here in just a second, but they're needed for the transport of goods. That's a huge thing. Now, not saying you couldn't eat a camel. I don't think that was normally what was done, and certainly their milk is useful. But the main use of a camel is to haul goods, and he had 3,000 of them. Again, let's go back. How much land do you have to keep 3,000 camels while they're not walking up and down in the caravans? How much land do you have to have? It's got to be a huge amount. And guess what? One person is not going to be over 100 camels. One person can maybe handle a few camels, maybe 10 camels. But that riata of camels is going to take a huge number of servants. So now we're starting to get the scope of who Job really was and why that term greatest in the East was there. Think about this. 500 female donkeys. Now, you may not have ever caught on to this, but female donkeys, why have them? Their only use in our eyes today is, hey, if you put them out in the field, they keep the coyotes off your cattle, right? Well, fair. You can also use them to make more donkeys, right? But there, having female donkeys, their milk was actually a prized possession. It was used in cosmetics. It was actually used as a baby formula, but the milk itself was considered a delicacy. 500 female donkeys were sort of like a dairy here in the U.S., but it was a high-end product. It was the Cadillac, if you will. It was the Mercedes-Benz of the milk products of that day. And he had 500 of those. Again, because we are talking about milking them, think of the structure that you've got to have. You're going to have milking barns. You're going to have fields. You're going to have hay to feed them. You're going to have grain to feed them. You're going to have a tremendous amount of agricultural acreage at your disposal in order to field these 500 donkeys. So I think a lot of times in the past, when I've read over it, before I really started to scrutinize this, I think it's probably pretty easy to go, oh yeah, he was a big farmer. This was the biggest operation in the East, in that area of his world. He's on the top of the heap. Let's look at one other thing. 500 yoke of oxen. A yoke of oxen is how many oxen? 2. He had 1,000 oxen yoked up in pairs. What are oxen used for? Plowing. You know the term acre, I don't have this up on the screen, but the term acre that we utilize, it comes from an Old English word called ager, which means field. And the way that a lot of the stuff that we have today, you can probably picture, most of you guys, when you think of acreage, you can almost picture in your head how big an acre is. But the way it was originally sort of defined was, it was how far a yoke of oxen, how much area they could plow in a day's work. And the way they did it was in long strips. They would take and they would furrow the ground in a pretty good long strip and then turn around. It wasn't done in a square like you might think of your garden setting it down in a square, because frankly, every time you have to turn the oxen, you're slowing yourself down, right? So they would take this measurement and they would do them in long strips, and they called those furrows long. They're around 660 feet, that's about 330 yards, but they're only about a tenth wide. So it was 1/10 wide as it was long, so it was 66 feet wide. If you take 66, you multiply it times 660, you get 43,500 and some odd change, and that's how many square feet is in an acre. And by the way, that furlong, that's how we got the word furlong, and that's what a furlong is, it's 660 feet. I know that really doesn't matter a whole lot to you guys, Old English conversion units and things like that, but we think about an acre today. I tend to, in my mind, think of it as a square, but it was really more about a long aisle and how much one oxen could do in a day, or one yoke of oxen could do in a day. This guy had 5,000, and you didn't have those oxen plowing just one time. You didn't even have them plowing just once a year, because you had rotating crops and you had different times of year that you would put in new crops. Imagine how much land that it took to have 500 yoke of oxen, that it was worth keeping and feeding them and having the servants on hand to use them. They must have been plowing thousands and thousands and thousands of acres of land. It's a tremendous operation. Of course, he probably needed to put in some grains, probably needed to put in some fruit-bearing plants, vegetables, because he had all these people to feed, and he had all of these herds to feed. And he not only had to feed them, but he had to prosper enough in order to sell all those goods, the wool and the other things that he made, the donkey milk. And ultimately, we're talking about an operation that is incredibly huge, an incredibly huge operation. Now let's talk about Job. Go back and look now in your Bibles and you'll see. Think about what this guy's running. He's doing it without a cell phone. He's doing it without a radio. He's doing it even without that phone you used to have hanging in the kitchen that had the big long cord so that you could stretch it around to the living room or sit at the table. None of us have that much anymore. A few of us might, but most of us don't. But doing it without all that, all you have is word of mouth communication. If you're going to get something out to one of these far fields, you got to get a servant, send the note out there, and come back. He's running wool production all year long. He's running milk production all year long. He's growing crops and harvesting those crops throughout the year. He's running camels and caravans to and from on the King's Highway and some of the other caravan ways to all over all the time. This man has got a huge amount of commerce going on, a huge amount of people. Probably some of them are relatives. Some of them may not be relatives. By the way, Job, we believe, and I only say we believe, but scholars go back and they look at that. It's not like I have a whole bunch of these old manuscripts in my house. But it's a fairly well congealed consensus that he essentially is one of Esau's descendants. Esau's descendants went over to the east, and it was a very fertile land. If you remember, Esau, of course, had some of the best land that was out there, but there was a segment of Esau's people who became great kings in that area that I was pointing out, where Uz is kind of close to. And it would make sense. It would make sense that he's from one of these lines. So yeah, he probably had a lot of resources at his disposal as he was coming up. But through his shrewdness, through his application of all these resources and blessings that he was being given, he mushroomed into this thing, and to the point that he was innately the greatest man in the East. Now, go over to verse 5. Somehow I kicked over to Esther, so now I got to go back to Job. Here we go. So, well, we'll start at the end of verse 3, where he was the greatest in the East. So in verse 4, his sons used to go and hold a feast in the house, so probably a big communal house, of each one on his day, and they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. So ultimately, it sounds as if these were some sort of feast and celebrations. You don't know if it was religiously organized or if it was simply how they dealt with feeding all those masses. I mean, you don't really know. But ultimately, one son would take maybe a week, and they would feed everybody, and they would take care of the sisters and the other sons, and then the next son would do that, and the next son would do that. And it says then, when the days of the feast had run their course, Job would send and consecrate them. So whenever those happened, was it a week at a time? Was it a month at a time? I don't know. But every time it went through all the cycles of all the sons feeding everybody, Job would then go and make sacrifices. He did it very often. And the sacrifice he would make would be a sacrifice not because something wrong happened, but the sacrifice he made, the offering he made to God, was just in case. Just in case. Look at what he says. He says, verse 5, and when the days of the feast had run their course, Job would send and consecrate them, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, it may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. Thus Job did continually. Not only was he fielding a tremendous amount of commerce, a tremendous amount of agriculture, a tremendous amount of relationships, being the boss over all these servants, having all of his sons and whatever eschatology that they had to keep all of this organization running. It's an incredible thing. I'll be honest with you, I got a master's in this type of stuff. I got a master's in public administration. I wish Job could have taught one of my classes. I would have loved to talk to him. Job, how did you keep everything running? Because there had to be rubs. I mean, there had to be people that got mad at each other. There had to be people that stood up and left and quit. There had to be. I would have loved to have had an opportunity to say, Job, how did you do all this with nothing but the sandals on your feet and what you could do with your 2 hands? None of the modern conveniences we have today. Now, when we look at this, I want you to kick a little further out in the book. And I know a lot of bad things are about to happen to Job, but you know what you're actually going to see? Job is going to talk about some of the things that he did, and he gives you a little insight of not just how he felt about his family, but look at what he felt like. If you go over to chapter 29, we'll use we'll use 29 for both of the next 2 points. But if you look at 29, I'm going to kick over real quick in my Bible. So in verse 29, or chapter 29, so ultimately, if you remember Job, and I'm not trying today to come back and revisit that whole story the way that you might do during VBS or you have a gospel meeting and say, hey, we're going to do 5 lessons on Job, or we're going to pare this book down, or we're going to crack it open. That's really not what I'm attempting to do today. What I'm really attempting to do today is give us an insight of who the man was, to see how great his loss was, because if you understand how great the loss was, it's only then that I believe you can understand how great his faith was. And that's really what it boils down to. So when you look at 29, let's look and see what kind of person he was. So he had 3 friends who felt horrible about all the bad things that happened. We'll go back and look at the bad things a little bit. But we all know he lives through some horrible things, right? And not only does he live through this tremendous loss, but he lives through loss of health. And eventually these 3 friends come and talk, and one of those friends says, Job, don't you know that this doesn't happen to righteous people? God doesn't do this to the people who are stepping and fetching for it. He does this with people who've done something wrong. That's what he said. Do what?
I'm going to have to disagree with this friend.
I'm
going to have to disagree with this friend.
Well, I think we get the hindsight, the 20/20 hindsight of reading the whole book and seeing everything. But in that moment, at that time, these 3 friends, which he valued, these are more than likely, my guess is, and that's all it can be as a guess, is there were people that were sort of like him. They probably ran outfits sort of like his, because they had to travel from a long way away, is what you come to find out. But yeah, we all look at that, we realize that they are in error. God ends up talking about how they need to repent. And we'll talk about that here in a second. But I will tell you that when you look at chapter 29, what you're going to see is Job's going to defend himself. He says, look, you're saying that I'm experiencing these things because of something I've done wrong. And he said, is it wrong to do these things? And he starts listing these things. So if you look over in verse 12 of 29, it says, because I delivered the poor who cried out for help, and the fatherless who had none to help him. The blessing of him who was about to perish came upon me, and I caused the widow's heart to sing for joy. I put on righteousness, and it clothed me. I was eyes to the blind, feet to the lame. I was father to the needy. I searched out the cause of him whom I did not know. And I broke the fangs of the unrighteous and made him drop his prey from his teeth. Job says, look, I spent my life. Yeah, I run this big business. But I've spent my life caring for those around me. The fatherless, the widow, the poor, the blind, the lame, the people who are caught in the clutches of the wolves of this world. He said, I've been their guy. He goes on and he talks about how benevolent he was, and then he actually talks about how people saw him. This is not him saying he's this way. He's going to show you what people saw him. So if you look down in verses 21 and 23 yet. So he says, verse 21. Sorry, I hit my Bible on the wrong 21. Here is chapter 29. Here we go. So verse 21. Men listened to me and waited and kept silent for my counsel. After I spoke, they did not speak again. Do you remember that commercial that used to be on the TV? I'm trying to remember what the product was. Securities group, someone who brokered securities. But if you remember, the commercial was when one of these brokers would start to talk, everybody else would listen because they wanted to hear what he had to say about what E.F. Hutton, is that what it was? I knew it was one of those investment firms, but they would say, when E.F. Hutton speaks, people listen. And that was what the commercial was. When he would start talking, everybody in the restaurant would stop and just try to listen to the advice he was giving his client, right? And so this is essentially what Job is saying here. He says, look, I didn't ask for this, but people came to me. People came to me, and they said, men listened to me and waited and kept silent for my counsel. Verse 22, after I spoke, they did not speak again. I'll tell you what I personally take from that, being someone who's been in the debate field, whether it be in courts or whether it be in interrogation, that kind of thing. What I think he's really trying to tell us here with that language is he said, once I said it, they didn't challenge me on this. They saw the wisdom of it. I think that's what's being stated. I think he's saying, hey, when I said it, they just didn't speak again. I answered their question, or I gave them what they needed. Continuing on, it said, after I spoke, they did not speak, and my word dropped upon them. They waited for me as the rain, and they opened their mouths as for the spring rain. Job was wise, and he was good. You know, he didn't have to spread that wisdom. You were about to say, I want to make sure that I said something.
Yeah.
Or that I let you say
I was
something.
reading that, who was getting the glory as Job was saying.
Oh, yeah, and of
It was
course,
all high. God was, but I know Job was for God. I mean, I know God blessed him. But that whole time he's saying this, it's all high, not God help me.
well, I think in the larger context, I know what you're saying, but Job is defending himself against another person. And he's saying that, hey, you're saying that I've been unrighteous. And he says, if these things are unrighteous, then I'm just going to have to be unrighteous because this is what I do. And he goes on and talks about those. I think, though, what you'll see, if you continue reading in the book, especially when you get over into chapters 37, 38, and eventually into 40, he does complain to God. He does complain to God, and God rebuffs him. Now, I want you to catch on to this. The point about what God did, that's coming from this. Rub it on the microphone. The point that we'll go back and we'll take a look at this because I think we'll have time to. Job, righteous man, upright, blameless, right? Let's go all the way back to that first chapter. Let's just go ahead and do it now. It's a great time. Let's just go do it right now. And this is going to tie into the sermon lesson, which is the reason why I chose this one. You go back and you look at that very first chapter. We told you all about Job and how he did all this continually, right? This book describes him as good, upright, and blameless. Verse 6. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. And the Lord said to Satan, "From where have you come?" Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and from on the earth, and from walking up and down on it." And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, blameless, upright man, who fears God and turns away from evil?" That was the exact thing that was mentioned earlier about him. The exact phraseology, right? God said, "You're going and you're looking all over the place. Have you seen my man Job? Have you seen my God Job?" Now, God views him this way. God views him this way. But it's not a wrench, but I'm going to throw something out in the middle of the floor, and I want you to consider it. Blameless isn't not committing sin. Blameless is not being held responsible eternally for that sin. Does that make sense? You remember what Job did? He offered sacrifices for not just himself, but really for all of his family in case they happened to have sinned, because he didn't want them to have that eternal responsibility for that sin, so that they could then, even though they sinned, be held blameless. I think we all want that too, and frankly, we desperately need it, right? But ultimately, we'll continue on. So Satan answered the Lord and said, "Does Job fear God for no reason?" Oh, ho, ho. Please take this concept and sit it in your back pocket. You're going to need it during the next dive. Does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You've blessed his work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. And of course, then the devil goes on and says, "Hey, strike him and he'll curse you to your face." He says, "But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." And the Lord said to Satan, behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand. And of course, Satan goes on to do that, right? These are the things that the book, from whoever wrote the book's perspective, from God's perspective, and what Job saw about himself was that he was good, that he was wise, that he continually offered sacrifices. He was conscientious, might even be the best term, that he was conscientious enough that he, in some ways, maybe even overdid sacrificing and offering so that everyone in his family was completely held blameless in the eyes of God. Now, so here's the challenge that Satan did. I'm going to boil it down to this core. Satan's challenge, take away all he's got. Hey, God, take away all he's got. And that guy you think is so faithful, his faith will die. That's really what he says. Take away all he's got, his faith will die. Now come back and cloak that concept, that challenge by Satan. And I want you to think about all that he has. We spent quite a bit of time talking about how big this operation is, how many sheep he has, how many female donkeys he has, all the wool, all the delicacy, cosmetics, and milk, all of that being transported back and forth, always going on, probably 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Really, really, really huge operation. You think about all of that, and you think all that's going on, but while he's doing that, he's still considering the poor. He's still considering widows. He's still considering fatherless. He's still considering people who are being oppressed. He's doing all of those things while he's running this huge business, and he's sacrificing to God continually. The loss that he sustains, just in his children alone, is hard for any of us to comprehend. But then you take on top of that, and that's a huge thing. That's a huge thing. But then take on all the position. Just think of how busy he was and how when that all went away, the only thing he had to do was sit around and think about it all day long. So he didn't have anything to do. Didn't have any camels. They were all taken away. Didn't have any sheep. They were all taken away. And he sat there. And he dwelled on it. I think you and I probably have run into scenarios where we've had a little too much time on our hands. And it's hard to see the positive if a negative gave us that time. It just is. There's probably been some of you who have had a disruption in your profession to where you had to go find another job. And that time period in between was probably really, really hard. Yes, sir.
It's the same thing when COVID happened. My routine was disrupted, and I didn't know the other things
I hadn't thought about that, and I really should have. That's an excellent point. He was mentioning that what happened to all of us during COVID? Our daily routine was taken away. And that was not healthy for us, was it? Oh, did we learn? We learned some stuff about ourselves and how we value what we value. We get all that. But the fact that it is, we had a lot of time to dwell. And that, for a lot of us, was a hardship. Now, Job's reaction, and this is stretched over many of the chapters in the book, but Job's reaction, he lamented, woe is me. I wish I'd never been born. Oh, this day of evil has come upon me. He had woe after woe after woe. Some skeptics will say, see, he whined, he cried about this. Yeah, anybody's going to. Doesn't mean that he's sinful, and he still kept his faith. And you're going to see why this is the jewel of the book that's written. There are literary scholars and writers in our past who look at the book of Job and they say, when I read this book, that it is absolutely the best book that's ever been written, or the best story that's ever been written. And they talk about the way it's written, and they talk about the structure and the mechanism of it. There's a lot to dive into, but let's continue going on. He not only lamented, he questioned. Why, God? Why is this happening to me? I fear doing that. You know, when hardships come along, I fear saying why. I strain to just not ask that question. You know, and a lot of it's because of my understanding of this book, but he definitely questioned. And guess what? He complained. He literally complained. He even said, my complaints are this, God. You did this to me. You allowed this to happen to me. Why have I not been your servant? And he complained. He never cursed him. He never stopped believing in him. And he never stopped being his man. But he did those things. He did those things. And I think that's one of the core reasons why we're given this book is for us to understand what it means to have faith during hard times. That it doesn't mean that you're going to say the sky is blue and the grass is green when the days are dark. That you're gonna call it like it is, but you're still gonna rely on God. And you remember what he said to his wife? She says, you know, why are you still talking good about God? Why don't you curse him? She actually says it, curse God and die. And he says, we've been blessed immeasurably by God. Will we not take the hard times when he decides they're coming our way after taking all the good? You know, so he remained that. Yes, Satan challenged, hey, take it all away, and his faith will die. You can almost hear him like that 12-year-old bully telling him, nah, take it all away, he'll die. You know, he's not saying this about Job, by the way. Do you realize that? And Satan's not talking about Job. He does not have disdain for Job. He knows Job's a human. He knows he has human wings, but that's not. You know who he has disdain for? He has disdain for God. He's saying, you're saying that this guy's great. He said, but you're wrong. You've protected him. He's not great. He's simply hiding in your shadow. Take away with your protections, and he'll spit at you. He'll pour your blessings out on the ground and kick dirt over them. That's what Satan's saying. Satan's disdain is for God. It's the reason why hellfire is safe for him, right? It's for him and his angels, that's why it's there. So that's really, I won't say nothing to do with Job, but Job is not his target. But Job's reaction, he hurt, like any human would and should. He lamented. He wondered why. And he complained about it like any human would. Yet that entire time, his faith never wavered. It never died. His faith lived. Heartbreaking loss. Heartbreaking loss. You know, when we say heartbreaking, until you see it, until maybe you've experienced it, it's just a word. I went to a memorial Friday night at Good Pasture Christian School. One of my former students, a week or so ago, came home from college, halfway through his first year of college, committed suicide. Nobody knows why. This kid was loved. He was kind. He was one of those guys who went, this is the way you want to be. And all those friends felt that way about him. I was talking with one of his close friends that I'm really close to, spent some time with me, and he had saw him that night. There were actually a bunch of them together, spending the night together. And he said, you know, he gave me a hug, a really long hug, and just asked about how my school was going. And this particular kid I'm talking about now played football or plays football at Tuscan University, and he was asking about his football season. He said and then when he said, but I got to go home, I can't spend the night. So he left. And this young man later or earlier that next morning went home and killed himself. I have his little sister in my class now, and she's a jewel to me. I love this kid. And so we're going into the auditorium, and there are hundreds and hundreds of people there, hundreds and hundreds of our students, his friends, his family, his mama, his grandmother, his dad, his sister. And they are heartbroken. They're heartbroken. I'd already decided to do this lesson before that ever happened. But I remember walking out of there with my wife, struggling to keep my throat from choking up and tears from running down my face so that I could put on a brave face for all my players and all the guys that I coached that I was going back out to talk to. How do you get through this? And I've talked to a bunch of them for a long way. I don't have a bunch of words of wisdom, but I was right there with them because I'm heartbroken over it. But his mom, his sister, I threw my arm around her and I said, I don't have any words. I just want you to know I love you. And she said, thanks, Coach K. Tears running down her face. And she's heartbroken. This man lost 7 sons and 3 daughters. And when you think about it, it was all to test his faith. Beyond that, he lost every bit of status he had in the area, and he was the greatest. He wasn't a mid-level guy. He wasn't a guy that was a so-so. He was the top. And not only did he do all of those things great, but he did them right. He had no one that would come up and say that you're evil, that you've made your millions on my back. That's not what. They all said, this guy's great. And ultimately, financial ruin, and then eventually false blame. Maybe, I know that heartbreak was horrible. I think the financial ruin, he probably looked at and says, I could probably get that back. I could figure that out. But this would be tough. This would be a kick to the gut to have the people turn on you after all they've seen you do and say, yeah, this is your fault. When it really, he knows it wasn't his fault. Tough. Now we get down to the reason why the book is written. And this is going to lead into our lesson. Job did not know why. Job, do you get that? He didn't know why this happened. We know why it happens. We see it now. We get it. Hey, we know. Yeah. This was a heavenly battle going on. Job didn't know that. This was just about Job to Job. That's all he could feel. That's all he could see. It was just about him. He did not know why. Why did he not know why? Because he had no special vision. He's looking through a thinly veiled world. He doesn't truly have proof that God is there. It's not like he had the Holy Spirit in him, like in the Apostles' days, where they could give you those gifts. That's what we're going to kind of talk about in the sermon today. This guy didn't know, and yet he still believed in God. He devoted everything to him, even in the greatest loss that has been cataloged against any one person. He still held that faith. God talked to Satan about that. Have you considered my man Job? You see, God desires that faith. He desires that thing where he's given free will to this person, and this person, out of their own choice, has said, I'm going to believe there's a God and that he's benevolent to me for all these good things. But I know there's a lot of folks that there's bad things, and they also don't believe that there's a God, or they believe in other gods. I'm going to choose him. I have enough reason, and it's not a blind faith, but it's a faith that just says, I'm going to choose him, and I'm going to live the way he wants me to live, and I'm going to do what he asks me to do, no matter what. That's what God seeks. Guess what? Satan doesn't do that. Satan knows exactly who God is, and every other angel that stands in front of him, they know exactly who he is, and they still rebelled against him. All the ones that went with Satan and his messengers. But all the people that are here that believe in God, they're believing in God, but they're looking through a veil. They only have partial information. It's remarkable, and that's why the book is written for us. It's to bolster us, because the days are here. They're not coming, they're here. When people will say, there is no God, there is no Jesus, and you're wasting your Sunday mornings, you're foolish, you're idiots. And like you, I'm going to remain faithful. I'm going to stay here. I'm not Job, and I don't ever want to be any part of what he had to go through. I don't want that. But I'm going to stay, and this world's going to keep attacking us. But I'm going to, and you're going to. And that's what the book is there for, is to realize that it can be done, should be done, and we can decide that it will be. I hope this has been a good study for you. I hope that your scope now, Job, has been expanded. And when we get into the next lesson, I hope you'll carry some of these things into it because I think it will help you. Thank you very much. We'll dismiss the class.